The year is 486 BC. King Xerxes, the first of Persia, has just succeeded his father, Darius, to a vast empire stretching from Central Asia all the way to the Mediterranean. But his empire is missing something. See, while the Persian army is the largest in the world, it's kind of hard to move that many troops across said world without an efficient system of roads. The western terminus would be near the city of Pelusium at the eastern end of the canal, and the eastern terminus would be near the city of Babylon. The entire project was over 1,700 miles long, which is longer than the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal combined. It's estimated that 100,000 laborers worked on the project in rotating shifts, each working 30 days followed by 30 days off. Well, the answer depends on where along the canal you're looking. Inundation was a constant threat to the canal, but the engineers built in several mechanisms to control the flow of water. They constructed dams to regulate the water's flow, as well as artificial lakes to store excess water. Hostilities with the Egyptians prevented the Persians from finishing the eastern portion of the canal, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a success. You see, back in the day, people believed canals couldn't be longer than 300 miles for fear they'd flood. 'Cause it turns out the King of Kings was also an engineer. But when the canal was completed, people realized that not only could canals be longer than 300 miles, they could actually be 1,700 miles long. Then be sure to subscribe and leave us a like. It really helps us out. That kind of thinking really helped launch the field of civil engineering forward. And today we have massive canals crisscrossing our planet. You see, in order to build the canal, the Persians developed new technologies and created countless jobs. It jump-started the local economy and helped facilitate trade between the East and the West. It even inspired Alexander the Great to continue the project after defeating the Persians. They also made sure to plant trees around the canal to help stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. For instance, parts of the canal followed natural waterways. Here's the thing about being an ancient engineer. You read pretty much on your own when it comes to solving problems no one has ever solved before. So no one really knew how to properly account for things like, the annual flooding of the Nile. And so every year the canal would flood, requiring the workers to repair the damage. In other parts, the canal builders dug through solid rock using the labor of convicts and slaves. To move the massive amounts of dirt, they created a series of ramps and embankments. And when the terrain was too uneven for the canal, they built artificial levees to keep the water from overflowing. Given the length of the canal, you can imagine how much dirt these workers moved. That's the equivalent of filling up 20 million dump trucks. And do unforget the workers had to do this by hand with basic tools like picks and shovels. And they finished it in only 8 years. That's impressive even by today's standards. Now, with projects of this scale, it's not enough to simply start digging. You need a plan. And what's the best way to get that? With more digging, of course, reconnaissance. So Xerxes decides to solve that problem by ordering one of the greatest feats of engineering in the ancient world: a canal to connect the two halves of his empire. Today, we're going to look at how he did it, how it failed, and why it still matters today. One major obstacle to efficient troop movement was the Nile River. Back in the day, if you wanted to get from west to east, your options were limited. You could go around it, which took too long, or you could try to cross it, which was pretty dangerous. They would have used basic surveying equipment like ropes and plumb bobs to determine elevations and the lay of the land. Then they would have had to check in with the king, because it turns out the route of the canal was right smack dab in the middle of a war zone. See? Between the Persians and the Egyptians was the Levant, a region that included modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Syria. And those folks didn't exactly want to be annexed into the Persian Empire. So the surveyors would have had to check in with the military to make sure it was safe to build. And if it wasn't, the engineers may have had to adjust the route of the canal to avoid hostile territory. The best way to get across was via a ferry, which was tricky because the Nile was wide and fast and had a reputation for wrecking boats. In fact, ancient Egyptian records refer to the king's fleet having great difficulty ferrying his army across the river during his invasion of Egypt in 525 BC. This inspired Xerxes to find a better solution. But this wasn't going to be some small canal either. Xerxes dispatched a group of engineers to survey the land and determine the best route for the canal. But once a suitable route was determined, the engineers got to work. But how did they do it? And then, after all that work, it rained. A lot. But despite all these measures, the canal couldn't hold back the waters forever. In the end, Xerxes Canal was never completed. But maybe the greatest legacy of Xerxes Canal is how it changed the way we think about impossible projects. So next time you see a canal, take a moment to appreciate all the canals that came before it, especially Xerxes Canal. That's all for this episode. Hey, want to help keep this channel afloat?